Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name's Kate Charters, and I'm the chair of SEGRA, the acronym for Sustainable Economic Growth for Regional Australia. I'm delighted to welcome you to our fourth of our conversations about the impact of COVID-19 on regional Australia. We've been pleased that we're fully subscribed to this session, and so it won't be possible for people to talk directly to the panel during the discussion. But there is a chat box on the bottom right-hand corner, and I strongly encourage you to use this to have input both in terms of questions and information about your own circumstances. We will review all the comments for input to future sessions, and also I'll try and ask questions as they come up. The recording of this event will be available on the SEGRA website later today, and you'll also notice at the top of the chat is a link to the resources we have put together. We've added a particularly good post from Michael Schumacher on comparative resilience, 8 principles for post-COVID reconstruction. I thought that was a very timely document given our discussions today. As this pandemic races across the world and Australian state and territory governments act to address an unfolding situation, SEGRA wanted to provide a forum where people who live and work and invest in regional Australia could advance the issues impacting on regional, rural and remote Australia. The idea of this webinar series is to assist in bringing together key issues and opportunities while hearing firsthand from people tackling the impacts of COVID-19 in regional Australia. These impacts will be across health, the broader economy, education, business, lifestyle and well-being, to name a few. We've pivoted our approach for today's sessions. We have been documenting the sorts of issues that people are confronting, and have found that we've generally gotten a full breadth of that. So now we're turning to things you can actually do in regional Australia. Before that though, I'll ask Robert to just go over our summary of the key issues that you've presented in a visual format. Thanks, Robert.
Thanks, Kate. Yes, I'll just pull up the latest version of our map. It's it's starting to evolve, and I think, as we've said, from the beginning, this was about starting a strategic discussion to work out how we could best influence the post-pandemic regional Australia and influence what sort of bridge and initiatives will be spent and sort of installed. What's becoming quite clear now, and I think we're at a little bit of a tipping point in our thinking, because even with the news of how the virus is slowing, it's giving us some hope to really think that coming out of this might be sooner than later. So all of a sudden, our discussions around issues, very soon we'll be getting to the point and say, well, that's fine, but what are the best ideas? We can't install everything. What will be the high impact initiatives or infrastructure to help rebuild regional Australia and position it? So I think we're getting very close to actually thinking about that. And in that sort of context as well, the way the map's unfolding, and I'll talk about a few things that have changed just this week, that our discussions are really coming around now 2 areas about hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. And we'll be getting to a point pretty soon about, well, with the funding and the sort of revitalisation money that'll be coming out, a lot of that will be about what will be the best infrastructure. And I think that conversation, as we move into this one, needs to be a more genuine collaboration between the hard built and thinking about the people side of it, rather than in the past, often those 2 camps are almost antagonistic. So I think that's becoming clear, because when you look at the issues in that over the last 4 or 5 sessions, particularly this first group, which is same as last week, there is that interesting mix of hard and soft initiatives. You can look through that. I've added 4 more sort of containers this week based on the 2 sessions we've had in the last week. And there's more area around people thinking about the support for the new business models that will emerge out of here, how we might take a special initiative to support those. It's coming up now in conversation about, well, those business models, how we're going to leverage circular economy and profitability and a whole lot of things in that thinking. And that's sort of really some of the business boxes emerging there. But the other thing I found interesting in the last few sessions is that reinforcing the notion that we will need a varied place-based solutions in regional Australia. And in the sense that not all of regional Australia has gone through drought, fire, and then COVID-19. And we already had conversations where some regions didn't have the fire, some weren't so bad in drought. So, and to me, this really reinforces our conversation that at the end of it, everyone in the regions will need to contextualise their best ideas. And even through our discussion, we don't want to be putting everyone in the same box of regional issues. So I think really pulling varied place-based solutions as an idea is really important. And the other thing that's come up this week I thought was really interesting, I've just titled it Crisis Storytelling, because a few comments around using the emergency structures, the sense that are we in emotional overload to hear another crisis story? How are we going to communicate and tell the story of the decisions we'll make for the best ideas to implement, as particularly the government money is there to help the transition back into a post-pandemic regional Australia. So they seem to be another few boxes we've added to it. So overall, that's where we're sitting with, I suppose, our discussions to date. And in some ways, those new boxes, I think, are an interesting segue to our speakers today around those initiatives. And I think it's going to be very interesting. One of the things, though, I just need to say before shoot back to you, Kate, is that based on just what's happening around the place at the moment, there's an opportunity that's come up at the place-based business level, that part of the work I do in place-based projects, I've always been very interested in how we do branding, storytelling, and sort of pitching around ideas. And in that sort of evolving internet world, what are the resources and tools and techniques that we can use in that space, and video and imagery. And there's a number of programs I've been involved in over the years to look at various ways of integrating those in my business and projects. But one of those programs is headed by Jamie Orr, who only a couple of days ago reached out to all his membership, and he's offering through his business basically a free video and image package for distressed businesses globally. There's about his, and we've got the links in the box today. The offer's only come out a couple of days ago. I suspect it'll be oversubscribed pretty quickly, but I thought it could be an interesting initiative for the businesses that are hurting in Main Street in regional Australia. America is a couple of weeks in front of us, and there's some really interesting initiatives they're doing in trying to deal with the horrific impact on local businesses. And I think we can interpret a fair bit of what they're doing, and it'll be some of the things I'll be looking at talking about next week, as we're getting more inquiries about how we can get some simple actions for distressed businesses in the Main Street right now while we're working on this bigger strategy stuff. So that's on the boil as well. We've got some links just to let you know. There's a link to a 10-minute video where Jamie's explaining why he's doing this. It's a genuine offer for 777 businesses worldwide. There's $500 worth of video packaging, and that's US dollars. So in today's currency, that's nearly $1,000 of Australian money he's offering. And there is a page the business can go to get information that he'll customize material. So I'm in his program, he's reached out to the network globally, and there's a lot of us have said, yeah, we'll help you do this as a genuinely free service, no strings attached. So that's the good news. The bad news is if you're interested in any of that and checking it out yourself, you've got to understand he's American culture is very intense and shouty and passionate. I think understanding their context and just listening to his story from that typical, I suppose, American storytelling. But it's an opportunity there. And if you've got distressed Main Street businesses that, particularly in hospitality, cafe, restaurant area, which something we'll be talking about next Wednesday as well. And I'll talk more about that at the end of today's session. but check it out. I dare say this offer won't last too long, but it could be some good materials that your mainstream businesses could leverage. So I'll just shoot it back to you, Kate, from that screen.
Thanks very much, Robert. So I think the thing that is interesting from what we've been covering today is that SEGRA, as you know, is really committed to place-based responses, and I think that both Chad and Colin have a lot of experience at delivering on the ground. So thanks very much. If I could now turn to you, Colin, thanks very much for joining us. Colin's from Startup Onramp. So firstly, Colin, can you introduce yourself and your company and a bit about the services you offer?
Thanks for the invitation. So I've been involved in the startup ecosystem around Australia for more than 10 years now. And 3 years ago, having seen a lot of startups fail and actually a lot of entrepreneurs who could start companies just never really make a start, it seemed to me that we're lacking some of the core entrepreneurial skills. And it's particularly acute in regional Australia. So what we're doing with Startup Onramp is creating and rolling out training and mentoring programs for budding entrepreneurs to help them create globally focused businesses rather than domestically focused businesses. And we'll get on, I'm sure, in the discussion to how the current COVID environment is in some ways a great driver for businesses to move online and to focus on global markets rather than domestic ones. But over the last couple of years, we've had the good fortune of working with 15 regional startup hubs around the country. In Queensland, we're funded by the Queensland government through the Advanced Queensland Initiative, and that allows us to deliver our program in partnership with almost all of the startup hubs that exist in regional Queensland. And they've been getting value out of that program and helping to train budding entrepreneurs, so people who have an idea for a startup or are perhaps in the first 6 or 12 months of building a startup, and give them some good guidance on how to maximize the chances of succeeding. Because we know that in the high growth startup space, so we're talking about globally focused businesses, there's about a 90% failure rate, and so that's pretty daunting to a lot of people. But what we've discovered, and we've certainly seen this in the regional communities where our program is running, is that most of those causes of failure of startups are actually predictable and avoidable. So our aim is to help people to understand what are the things that they might likely do that seem like it's probably the right thing, and perhaps would be the right thing if they were running a bricks and mortar retail business or some kind of traditional business model. And as Robert said earlier, we now need to be thinking about innovative business models and perhaps trying things that we haven't done. The other thing that we're doing is working interstate with partner organizations to roll out our programs in their communities. So I guess philosophically, our aim is to help regional Australia to produce more entrepreneurs and more successful businesses, particularly those that are going for global markets.
Thanks very much, Colin. So just to pick up on your last point, have you got some ideas about what people in regional Australia could be doing now, local governments or RDAs to Regional Development Australia organisations to encourage entrepreneurial activity in their regions now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are some really simple things that people can do. One is that, despite the obvious challenges of living through a pandemic, it's actually for a lot of people an opportunity, because there are going to be a lot of people who are spending time at home, and yes, of course, they're going to try and do some things to generate an income. And if they're like a lot of families, they've got kids that they're trying to do homeschooling. But I think there is still an interesting opportunity for those folks to spend time working on some ideas. And I think there is some good guidance that people can be given around what makes a good idea and how they make a start on exploring it. But we're already seeing a lot of existing businesses trying to reposition themselves from an in-person delivery of a product or a service to an online delivery. And some will be successful, a lot unfortunately won't. I'm by no means an epidemiologist, but from everything I've read, I would suggest that the likelihood is that we will have a sustained period of lockdown or something approximating lockdown for up to 12 months. So you would all be familiar with the flattening the curve thinking and the hammer and dance. I think where Australia is heading is a hopefully successful flattening of the curve, but that also extends the period in which people are going to be unable to work on businesses. So for what it's worth, my high level view is that a lot of businesses will just not get through to the other side of this, regardless of government stimulus and other support. And people would do well to start thinking now about what other businesses they could create and get going over the next 6 to 12 months.
And thanks, Colin. That's certainly one of the stories that we're hearing is being ready to start up again is really quite important, and how we use the time now so that when startup's happening, we've got something to start up. So thanks very much for that. If I could now go to you, Chad. Thank you very much for being part of this conversation today. Chad is from Startup Status, a not-for-profit group which supports entrepreneurs in Australia with a focus on non-metro areas. So can you tell us a bit more about what services Startup Status is and a bit of your own background?
Yeah, you bet, Kate, and thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with Robert and Colin as well. So Startup Status started a few years back to really map and measure the impact of entrepreneurs and innovation across Australia, as well as help regional areas to support the development of their entrepreneur communities. Because we know that entrepreneur communities, particularly in regional areas, it's not just one innovation hub or one economic development body. It really does take that community around of government, corporations, business community, education, university, training providers. The journey for an entrepreneur can be complex, and so we do need a lot of people on board. So Startup Status helps bring those around. A couple other roles I wear is I'm the managing director for the Global Entrepreneurship Network, which then connects entrepreneur communities to a global network to help them scale their business. And I'm also working with a couple of universities, including QUT, with the Australian Centre for Entrepreneurship Research around the measurement on how we measure the impacts of this, and also with USQ and the Rural Economy Center of Excellence on how we actually embed this into the fabric of how communities operate. So really trying to take that holistic view, of which then we can then create the foundations by which programs such as Colin's Startup Onramp can then be best utilized in those regions.
So if regions are thinking at the moment about what are 2 or 3 things they could do to encourage an entrepreneurial framework or mindset, what would those be, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kate. And a lot of people are asking, what can we do? And I think it's important just to start off the conversation with an awareness on what's just happened. When you think about disruption in business, it usually takes years, if not decades, from taxi services to photo processing to your local video store, right? And it's taken years for those to be impacted. What we've seen literally overnight in the matter of an hour, we have just seen any business with anything to do with physical contact or on-site activity completely be transformed. Their fundamental model has changed. That's scary. There's a lot of people whose livelihood, if not lives, are wrapped up in that. However, exactly as Colin was mentioning, this is also an opportunity to say, well, how do we rethink our business model? How do we work through the fear? We need to acknowledge it. This is something that we're all going through. But what could it look like? Now, there are people in the community, such as Colin and people who deliver Colin's programs, that are used to thinking about different business models. And quite often, Colin and I joke, the test is, how do you sell to someone in Connecticut? Not that Connecticut's anything special, but it's sufficiently not, your local region from Bunbury to North Burnett. So how do I sell to outside? And so from a region perspective, how does the local government, the economic development organization, help facilitate conversations with business through that path? How does your local innovation hub or co-working space reposition themselves for a bit of virtual support? Because the businesses that are using their services need it just as much. They just don't actually have a physical space. So how do we build that community virtually? Your local chamber of commerce, how do they engage with businesses? I can't have my major networking event, but can I network virtually? The other really fascinating thing, and I'll wrap up with this one, is how this activity has expedited. It's rapidly brought to the forefront a change which we've been trying to have happen for years. Within Australia, we know that 1/3 of the population the value, and businesses are located outside of metro areas. You know, it could be 2070 down in Melbourne or Sydney. It's 50-50 in Queensland. But quite often, a lot of the centralization of innovation and conversations happen in those metro areas. And quite often we do things like this and live stream to regions almost as a token to bring them in. Well, all of a sudden, it's like everybody's in a regional area. How do we take advantage of this? Acknowledging the challenges with internet connectivity, and get people online in a rapid way, get that digital acceptance. But all of a sudden, like this webinar we're having now, I could be in New York, Colin could be in Boston, Robert's in Europe somewhere. It really doesn't matter. We've all of a sudden gone global overnight. We don't necessarily have the answer, but for a Main Street business, you know, especially in a regional area, they can look and say, well, what could a global audience look like? Whether it's for a recipe platform, or it could be something seemingly simple, but all of a sudden I have a broader market. How do I access that? And how does a region come together to help people through that conversation?
Thanks very much, Chad. Sorry, Robert.
No, sorry. Yeah, look, I have a good question for both Colin and Chad, because I'm just wondering, and I mean, you've given a very honest overview, but what do you think might be the real creative challenges for entrepreneurial structures when we're talking about hubs and everything else, in the sense that they were the child of an economy that was growing, and it was the sort of strange startup and all that, and we have our little regional hubs and everything. But in a sense, that structure that your ecosystems have nurtured, the world has changed. And if you're saying now that you need to service everybody in regional Australia, and I just wonder, in throwing back introspectively, isn't that like a different problem to solve for your organisation? Will that mean that even, you know, co-working spaces and hubs might have worked pre-COVID, but that's backward thinking to what your structures need to be to encompass everyone? Look, both your thoughts on that.
I'm happy to go first. Yeah, look, I think it's going to be super challenging. I would argue that in most regions around Australia, the startup hubs or co-working spaces are actually not startup hubs for the most part. I'm generalizing, and there are some for sure that genuinely support the creation of startups as we might define them, as businesses that are aiming to go global. Unfortunately, what we've seen is that a lot of regions, not for want of goodwill and good intent, but they actually lack the critical mass of expertise and programming to be able to help people start global companies. And so what we see is a lot of these startup hubs are in effect helping people to create small businesses. And in the most extreme examples that I've seen, they are, again, with the best of intent, they're really life support for people who are working on business ideas that they're really only partially viable at best. So I think there's an opportunity, but also a big challenge where we have to shift the thinking quite a long way to say we really, at the other end of this pandemic, we really can't allow ourselves to go back to, you know, what the PM calls, you know, this kind of hibernation and restarting of businesses. I think that's a nonsense. If we have people restarting small bricks and mortar, partially viable businesses that might, you know, generate an income for them, in the hope that in a year or so from now they'll be able to successfully restart and rejuvenate economies, I think that's nonsense. I think we actually have to intervene, and I think the federal and state and local governments have an important role to play, as do organisations like RDA, to be able to get those regional communities thinking differently and thinking about what it takes to create a business model that can service a global market. And this is actually not trivial, because most people anywhere in Australia, whether you're in Sydney, Melbourne, or a rural area, have not had the experience of building global businesses. So it's actually, there are a bunch of things I think we can do. One is to inject that expertise. So if you're in an area where nobody has the experience of growing a global company, then it's highly unlikely that you're going to be able to give people good guidance by gathering people around a table and saying, well, how do we do this? It's just not plausible that people will figure it out in isolation. So I think for governments in particular, there's a role to intervene and say, we will find ways to inject that expertise into that community and it might be a visiting entrepreneur program, it might be an online mentoring program. We're contributing to that in the way that we can, which is by providing programs to impart skills and some online mentoring. But there are a whole bunch of things that I think are missing. I think the fear I have for regional communities is that we'll get to the end of this pandemic and then we'll attempt to restart, and a whole lot of business will just be unable to restart. They won't have the capital. The customers will be accustomed to buying online. Consumers will be thinking as global consumers rather than local consumers. And I think that's a thing that we all need to try and avoid.
We were saying that the other day, that our digital our digital skill sets and familiarization is rapidly growing at the moment. Chad.
Yeah, absolutely, Kate. And those are really good points, which I agree with entirely, Colin. And it's acknowledging that what we're actually seeing is a fundamental change in the DNA of how we're doing business. You know, before, Kate, as you mentioned, the digital skilling was almost a nice to have. We'd have the sessions where we try and teach people how to use browsers and things like that. All of a sudden it becomes a necessity. But there is still an emphasis on local. So obviously we have local production in regions. There's a lot of local product, everything from locally made arts to locally made food, obviously the agriculture. And so how do we really leverage our strengths? But we do need that injection of new thinking. I also agree with Colin in regards to the assessment on innovation hubs, co-working spaces. I think we will still have a bit of the co-working space model, just like we have churches, just like we have other forms of third spaces where like-minded tribes come together and they do their thing. And I think that's incredibly valuable because you can facilitate connections and relationships. But for the actual content, we have gone global. But what it does, and Colin's program is really impressive, because what Colin's doing, even though his program supports entrepreneurs, his core focus is on creating an army of facilitators, of people who can distribute this program anywhere. And so realistically, whether it's Joy and Dave in Toowoomba, or Elise up in Rocky, or somebody else across Australia, anybody can hop onto that Startup Onramp program and learn these new business models. But how do we then actually get some of the local economic development practitioners on that same program, walking alongside the local entrepreneurs to help them leverage the core assets of the local community as they build their business? So let's not be afraid of it. Let's lean into the concern and say, let's incorporate our strength into what we're doing. Let's really leverage the assets we have, and then take advantage of this new global phenomenon that we're going to experience, and also give ourselves a lot of grace, because none of us have been here before. We're all figuring it out. And everybody who says, oh my God, I feel so far behind, well, you're only half a step of that person up there that figured it out yesterday. So we're all learning as we go here, and we can all just give it a shot.
Thanks, Chad. Robert, Robert, are you going to ask another question?
Yeah, well, because I'm really interested in where we were before COVID in regional Australia and entrepreneurialism, and that whole almost cultural chasm. And then, what was the problem there that really a lot of the existing business and culture was reluctant? You now have rightly said we've got this dramatic change. Surely, what do you think will really be the underlying problem when we come out of this, in the sense of the transitioning? Because it's a desperate time for businesses to restructure, and as Colin was quite honest about how grim it could be for some. And I'm just wondering, that challenge, do we really understand it enough? Because I'm just concerned a bit, if we do roll out the way we were thinking with entrepreneurial support and other aspects, what more would we need to do? What would we be missing or need to do differently in this time? Because the scale seems massive.
Yeah, it is. And Robert, you and I were having a chat about this recently in regards to, in the past, it has felt very much like you have the innovation ecosystem, your innovation hubs and your accelerators and your co-working spaces and the skinny jeans and the black t-shirts and the pitch events and all of that stuff. And that has value, and that's good. It's excitement, and it inspires. And then over here, you have traditional economic development, infrastructure, major investment attraction, and government support and institutions. And it's almost like these two different worlds. And what we see, what my hope is, and I'd be interested in other people's perspectives on this, is that the COVID situation is going to expedite those two fields coming together, where it is just simply an economic diversification portfolio. Everybody thinks entrepreneurial. Nothing would make me happier than if we didn't need innovation hubs, because we all thought innovation. We just did it in our corporations, in our schools. People graduated with an opportunity to be an entrepreneur as much as anything. Colin's program, Colin, bless your heart, I would love it if we didn't need your program. Because if people could just go through it, I think we're years away from that. And I think things like Colin's program will evolve and adapt and become more pervasive and more integrated and embedded with what we do. My hope is that COVID is actually going to expedite that process, but we do need everybody around the table. But I'd be interested in other people's perspectives.
Colin?
I'd be happy to add to that.
Yes, thanks.
Sure. So I guess the good news, if we can look at it this way, is that Australia is in a lot of ways playing catch up with a lot of other countries that have figured some of this stuff out well ahead of COVID. So if we look at, and I did some of this research when we wrote the first few Crossroads reports for Startup Oz, which looked at the national startup landscape and did an international comparison to say, how are we faring relative to a lot of other countries? And the reality is that there are a lot of countries that have, over the last decade, figured out a lot of this stuff. So we actually don't need to work it out by ourselves. We can look to other locations where there are similarities, particularly in regional areas, and say, what have they done? What's worked? What hasn't worked? And the things that have been effective there, could we translate them and do them here? So I don't think there's actually anything terribly difficult about doing it. It's more a matter of making a long-term commitment and having the resources. So one of the things that we looked at, for example, was in Singapore. Over about 8 years now, the Singapore government has run Silicon Valley immersion programs for young entrepreneurs. And they've taken, it's now upwards of 5,000 young people from Singapore over that period of time and put them in 6 to 12-month placements in places like Silicon Valley, Beijing, London, Stockholm, and Tel Aviv. So that gives you a sense of the scale of the approach. So I think, one of the things that we as a group can do is to lobby the federal government and state governments and say, if we're going to come through the other side of this and have a chance of doing economic transformation, we really have to throw the kitchen sink at it. So the government is throwing the kitchen sink at stimulus and a whole bunch of other initiatives right now. So in a way, I think we have a unique opportunity where the government's hopefully going to be quite receptive to saying, well, how do we massively reposition our economy at the other end of this?
Thanks, Colin. I suppose one of the questions that this has brought to mind, and I'll give you a chance to give us both of you a chance to give us your web addresses so that people can follow up on particular suggestions that have been made. But do you have a sense of scale, like in regional and rural Australia, and even in remote Australia, we have the occasional success story of someone who's started a business from scratch. But is there an optimal scale for a community culture of entrepreneurship?
Chad, do you want to take that, or would you like me to?
Sure, I'll give it a shot. Look, absolutely, density and redundancy are critical, meaning density is how many people of a certain type do I have? Do I have a government representation? Do I have a technology support? Do I have a pool of people that might be an entrepreneur? Because not everybody is entrepreneurial thinking per se. And then also redundancy, where if I get that one leader who decides to move out, what else do I have? One of the things that's really struck me in the work that I've done in regions is quite often we go in there and we can run programs, right? And we can inspire everybody and get them all together to think differently. But what do we use to inspire them? We go to everybody to be inclusive and inspire them with stories of the one. With the story of safety culture, or Jesse from up in Townsville, or Varian over in Mackay. Hey, look at that person, they made it. If you think or you look like them, maybe you can make it too. So what we're doing is we're actually after everyone in order to find the one. So that critical person in the community, I think this COVID situation is going to expand out those individuals. But I think we always need to respect that it is going to be a select few people that are going to give it a go. And our job as a community is to go around them and do what we can to support them. I think that even like a town of 600 out in Quilpie, that you have so many stories of where it is just that one person out there who says, I think I can give it a go. I think I can set up that gym on a corner store, which is then all of a sudden expanding out, maybe then offering virtual gym memberships to people to do online courses, you know, in Quilpie, you know, like you can start these things anywhere. It's just helping that person frame. And so a couple of things. One, do they understand the technology? Two, do they understand the different business models and options that are there? And three, just can we give them a bit of that belief that, you know what, anybody can give it a go? Because within Australia, we do have one of the higher levels of fear of failure. We also have one of the higher levels of internal entrepreneurship or intrapreneurship. So we have been a fairly comfortable nation. We've never had a down year. We will no longer be able to say that. As Colin says, how do we take advantage of it? Those are my thoughts though, but Robert and Colin, interested in your perspectives. Colin.
Yeah, happy to jump in. I agree with all of that. I would add that for regional communities, we can actually reframe the question and talk about virtual communities, because I think for the 12-month period, let's say that people will be largely separated from their physical community. I think we can encourage people to join virtual communities, and there are lots of them. There are lots of ways that people can engage with like-minded entrepreneurs. And I think to the question about scale, I think there is a critical mass element to this. So if you're in a community, whether it's face-to-face or online, and it's you and, you know, a ragtag group of 2 or 3 other aspiring entrepreneurs, it's very difficult. Whereas if you're in a community where you're surrounded by, you know, dozens of people that are building similarly ambitious businesses, it's a bit like, so I'm a keen runner, and I find that if I run with people who are faster than me, I get faster. And if you run with beginner runners, and it's probably the same with every sport, you know, you're not challenged. So I think we would do well to find ways to immerse people in, for now, online communities where they're surrounded by people who have a higher level of ambition and maybe some more experience, and maybe have done 1 or 2 of these companies before, because then, you know, we'll find that people catch up pretty quickly. They work it out quickly. They absorb information from those folks pretty readily. I would disagree, I think, with Chad's view about co-working spaces. I think, you know, WeWork is going to evaporate. It won't exist after COVID. A lot of other co-working spaces have already evaporated. I think there's an important role for them as hubs to bring the community together. As you're saying, you know, a bit like the church, you know, as a community hub, I think there's a role for them, but I don't believe that they are the best place to try and create physical clusters of entrepreneurs, particularly in smaller regional and rural areas. I think that's all going to become an online community.
One of the things that Robert and I have been doing is we've been running some sessions, for example, out at Quilpie, where we try and get people to shape their big idea into their best idea. And we found that leaders in smaller communities are bubbling with ideas, but it's a matter of working out which their best one is. Now we've just got a comment from Gordon Hay in the chat box, and he says contact the Trade Start Network at Austrade. It's Austrade have a landing pad in Silicon Valley, and if you go to that the chat box, he's put the web address in. So thank you very much for that, Gordon.
Kate, I'd like just to follow on the threads that Chad and Colin were talking about, because I think there's a universal principle under there that Colin was talking about is the nature of mastermind groups and learning from successful people. And I think those universal principles are going to be, how we tell the story in the new space is going to be really important, because I think we need new labels and new stories, rather than a lot of regional Australia that needs to change quickly has got a label about entrepreneurism and hubs and a whole lot of things, and it's a barrier. It's a different tribe. But as Colin was saying, I think if you peel down deeper, what the human aspect is about mastermind, associating with people around your particular interest, which might be highly entrepreneurial or only a little bit entrepreneurial. I think there's a real truth in that, and that may be in a way of different places with the different communities and levels of interest. Those sort of sharing groups maybe have different labels, but they all have the same sort of purpose. But I'm just so mindful of all the work we do out in regions pre-COVID. You know, the whole entrepreneur, you know, is a word that became out of political appeal. There's a whole lot of things that is baggage around some of our language, and I'm a storyteller. Our challenge in storytelling around this moving forward will be.
Yeah, absolutely, totally agree with you, Robert. Like when we did research into member bases at hubs, only about 11% of them identified value from the actual physical space itself. Everything else is exactly as you were talking about. It's community, it's access to networks, it's access to all the other aspects that the hub provides. And in fact, I know when I was running one myself, even though we had about 70 or 80 members, you come in on a Tuesday at 3 o'clock and I have like maybe 3 or 4 people there because they're actually out there running their business, or people are used to working from home, the value that you get from them. So I think you're right. I think hopefully this is going to burn away a lot of the artificial perceptions on value propositions that the ecosystem had. And also the language is absolutely critical. You know, and I even work on it as far as, and I've heard Colin's narrative change over time as far as how we talk about startups and founders and entrepreneurs and ecosystems and all this completely foreign language, when actually we're just talking about how do you do business? How do you do business better? How do you do business new? Things are changing. Let's help you change with it.
Look, thank you very much, Colin and Chad. We're running out of time very quickly. If I could just get you, Chad, to give your web address, and then I'll get Colin to give his.
You bet. www.startupstatus.co. That's startupstatus.co. And you can contact me there and happy to support.
Thanks. And Colin?
So we're at startuponramp.com, and I'm happy to circulate a link to a couple of things that might be of interest to people on the webinar today.
Thanks very much for that. Well, thank you both, Chad and Colin and Robert, of course, for your participation. We'll circulate a communique that captures the ideas in today's conversation, and we'll include those email addresses that the website addresses that we've just talked about. We also have a latest news section on the SEGRA website, and under the general button put together some useful websites for people to access. If you'd like to contact me directly, my email is kate@segra.com.au or robert@vitalplaces.com.au. We have another webinar on Tuesday where our focus will be on the role of leaders and the role they can play in the crisis. We have Sarah Hales from I'll just grab that, The Bold Effect, and Dave Hare, who's a speaker and consultant on business leadership in regional Australia. We've also, as Robert alluded to earlier, been asked if we can run a similar conversation for businesses in regional Australia, and we'll run this next Wednesday at 11 a.m. So when you get that email, could you please be mindful of businesses that are being disrupted by the COVID-19 and forward the email to as many relevant businesses in your region as possible. So thank you again very much. Have you got a closing comment you'd like to make, Colin?
Yeah, I guess I'd just reinforce the point that we actually have an amazing opportunity. It's pretty challenging times, but I think we have an opportunity to do economic transformation over the next 6 to 12 months. So I'd encourage everyone to think about how they might get some things underway while we can.
Well said. And Chad, have you got a closing remark?
Yeah, just reiterate the same. And again, it is a challenge. We do have opportunity. Take advantage of the platforms and solutions that are out there. And Colin's Startup Onramp is a good one if that's running in your area. Even if it's not, there's opportunities for virtual participation. It really just does help you think about how to do new things in a structured way. So if you do get an opportunity, startuponramp.com, check it out. There might be a program running that you might want to engage with or pass on to people that you work with to help them think about differently and navigate through this process.
And so it seems that there are some real lessons and materials out there that regional Australia can access. And at the moment, a lot of them are online. But getting businesses talking to each other might be a good first starting point, so that they can together plan for how they're going to move on post-COVID-19. Thank you all very much for your time, and I look forward to talking to you again at Tuesday's next webinar. Thank you.